In the spring of 1986, I was eligible for a paid sabbatical leave, and as part of my sabbatical proposal, I had written up what I thought was a brilliant reason to spend my summer or my spring hiking canyons and running rivers. And I wrote it off as a primary study of Edward Abbey locations. Ed had written a letter of support for me, precisely as I dictated it to him. And everything was looking good. I was granted the sabbatical, and then in November I was out backpacking in the Superstitions, and I blew my knee out and required surgery, and there went my plans for the spring. In the meantime, I had fallen in love with a girl in Northern California, and I thought I would just go rehab and rest up at her place after the surgery. And at some point in March, I was in Auburn, California, and I came home. I'd gone out and done my first river trip since surgery up on the North Fork of the American River. And when I got home that evening, Sherry said, "Ed called about an hour ago and wanted to know if you'd like to meet him in Bluff in 3 days, in Bluff, Utah, and travel cross country with him." Ed was doing research for what would become essentially his final novel, Fool's Progress, Hayduke Lives, and a couple of other collections were published posthumously, but this is the last thing that Ed wrote when he was alive. And it's a pilgrimage back to his roots in home Pennsylvania. He has a fictional character that is very thinly disguised, Ed Abbey, and this is the book that Ed had always considered that was going to be the fat masterpiece, the big novel. And he called and asked if I'd like to travel with him from Bluff back to home Pennsylvania. And it sounded good to me, so essentially, I left California, got back to Arizona, grabbed a couple of things, drove to Bluff, met Ed at John Dupuy, an artist friend of Ed's, and also one of the primary characters in the Monkey Wrench Gang. Dupuy is Doc in the Monkey Wrench Gang. And I met Ed there, and we drove across country. I had my old Dodge 318 converted mini home, Old Yeller, that we traveled across country in. And we'd spend the days. Ed was recording notes from different landscapes that he wanted to use in the novel. I spent my time photographing Ed in different locations, and we traveled cross country. There's one shot that Ed and I treated pretty much as a throwaway shot. It was just a gag photo that has become semi-iconic and has been used in a couple of documentaries already. And that's this shot of Ed flipping off a nuclear plant on the banks of the Ohio River. Neither of us paid much attention to it, and then after Ed died in 1989, about a year or so later, Eric Temple was doing a documentary on Ed. He called and asked to use some of my work. I granted him permission. I ended up leaving Ed with his folks. His dad, Paul Revere Abbey, was a jack of all trades. He had been a miner, he had been a lumberman, he had helped transport horses across the Atlantic to Europe at the end of World War II. He was an atheist, an anarchist, and a teetotaler. Ed's mom, Mildred, played piano in the local Methodist, I believe, church, maybe Lutheran, I believe it was the Methodist church. She taught Ed to love classical music and classical literature, and I think after spending time visiting with his parents, it became quite evident that the person that he became was a reflection of those very disparate parts that his parents represented. So the question is, what did the trip with Ed mean to me? That's probably haven't thought about that in the last 25 years. It was an opportunity to learn things about Ed that were not part of his public persona. We talked about why he had written initially, about what he had intended to do with his life. We talked about his many marriages. Ed had been married, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 times he was married to Clark, his final wife, when I got to know him during the last decade of his life. We talked about his career as a writer. Ed had always wanted to be a novelist. He felt in order to be an artist, to be seriously considered as an artist, he had to write a novel, hence the Fat Masterpiece. And I recognized what most people have recognized, that Ed was not a brilliant novelist, he was a brilliant essayist. And I asked him how he'd feel if that's what the memory was, if he went down in history as a hell of an essayist. And he said he just hoped that somebody would remember him for something. So in total, one was a chance to get to spend personal time with Ed, and this was in the spring of 1986, and 3 years later, by 1989, Ed was dead, allegedly. A lot of us are not really sure, but allegedly Ed had died by the spring of '89. It was also a chance for me to travel cross country. I had spent my life in the western United States. I had spent a lot of time in the bottom of canyons all over the Southwest, and in Utah and Colorado and in Idaho and Oregon and Northern California, but I had never gone east. And so it was a chance to see some new country. And I suppose in reflection, maybe it's important because every decade or so, someone shows up with a camera and says, do you mind if we take a little time with this interview? So on the basis of having done very little in my life, I get to show up every decade or so and get, Andy Warhol was wrong, I get 15 minutes every 10 years.